Good morning, everybody. We are beginning chapter 14 of Shemuel Bet. In our last chapter, we saw the house of David get a little bit more chaotic with the whole drama between Amnon and Tamar and Abshalom, which ended in bloodshed. Abshalom killing Amnon, his brother, at the command of his guards. His servants, his Naim, and as a result, Abshalom was banished into a kind of exile. And we noted the last pasuk of chapter 13 said, "Vatechal hamelech latzet et Abshalom." David was pining away for Abshalom. He felt bad that Abshalom had to go into hiding. Kinicham al Amnon kimet, for he had gotten over the fact that Amnon was dead because of what Amnon had probably done. So after a while, he gave up on Amnon and he moved on. But Abshalom now was away, and despite Abshalom's terrible act, he understood that Abshalom did it for a reason. Abshalom was doing it to defend the honor of his sister and his family. And so now we begin chapter 14 with David and one of his sons, Abshalom, away. David's pining for him. And so Yoav, David's general, is going to try to manipulate the situation to find a way to bring Abshalom back. This chapter is not going to have as much excitement as some of the previous chapters, but it is a very important chapter in understanding how the dynamics are working between David, Yoav, and Abshalom to best understand what we're going to get to next week with the chapters of Abshalom's rebellion against David. So in the next couple of chapters, Abshalom, his son, is going to rebel against David. How did we get to that point? Because here, David and Abshalom look like they have a great relationship. David is pining over Abshalom. How do we get to the point where Abshalom wants to undermine and try to take away the kingdom from his father? So that's what this chapter is going to be. It's a bridge chapter. Very important to keep in mind those things because it's going to set the stage for the future. So here we go. Chapter 14. We're on page 747. Yes. We know that Abshalom's mother was a woman by the name of Ma'acha, and she was the mother of both Abshalom and Tamar. Amnon was a separate child. Yes. Come on in. Huh? So it's on. The Zoom is on. I see my Aunt Barbara's on, but I don't see anybody else. So. The truth is, I don't really use mine. I'm looking up on the screen. So if you want to take a look over here, we're on 747. Here we go. Vayeda Yoav ben Tzeruya ki lev hamelech al Abshalom. Yoav, the son of Tzeruya, could see that the king's mind was on Abshalom. He could tell that David was pining for Abshalom. So instead of just bringing him back, Yoav does something that we've already seen done in the past with David. He tries to orchestrate this kind of mashal, this kind of parable, this kind of big scene to get David to kind of understand why he should bring Abshalom back. Because if you're David, why are you not bringing Abshalom back? If you really want Abshalom, why are you leaving him in exile?
Saving face.
Saving face for why?
Because he did kill one of your kids. He did what you didn't do. Maybe
exactly. David's caught between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, he understands why Abshalom did what he did, and he respects Abshalom for that, and he wants Abshalom back. On the other hand, he cannot publicly endorse murder. In the end of the day, Abshalom killed in cold blood one of his other children. He can't endorse it. So David's stuck. So Yoav is going to try to give David the way out through this mashal, how David can justify bringing Abshalom back into the picture. Vaishlach Yoav Tekoa. Yoav sends a message to Tekoa, Vaikach Misham Isha Hachama, and he brings from there a very clever, wise woman. Notice, by the way, again, that theme comes back. We had that in the last chapter when Yonadav was the Ish Hacham, right? So they're trying to find other wise people. Vayomer Eleha, and Yoav said to her, Hit'abelina, go into mourning, velivshina bigde evil, and wear clothing of mourners. V'al tasuchi shemen, don't anoint yourself in oil, don't put on makeup or anything. V'hayit ki isha ze yamim rabim mit'abelet al met, and act like a woman who has been grieving over somebody who they lost for a very long time. So he's going to stage a woman coming before the king who looks like she's been mourning over a loss for a very long time. Ubat el hamelech v'dibart elav, and you're going to come in front of the king. You're going to request an audience and come to an audience with the king. And you're going to say to him, Kadavar hazeh, exactly what I'm telling you. Vayasem Yoav et advarim befiha. And Yoav tells her what he wants her to say. Vatomer ha'isha ha'tiko'it el ha'melech, vatipol al apeha arza vatishtachu, vatomer Hoshia ha'melech. And now the story begins that the woman indeed from Tekoa comes before the king. She falls and prostrates herself on the floor, on the ground, and she says, Hoshia ha'melech, save me, my king. So what's about to happen is an orchestrated play by Yoav, which is intended to strike the heart of the king, right? It's going to try to move the king in some way to bring back Abshalom. And everything here is being orchestrated by Yoav, David's major general. Now you're going to ask me the question, why do we need a wise woman if Yoav is telling her exactly what to do? So Rabbi Bazak explains it stands to reason that the two of them kind of work together to orchestrate this idea. Yoav didn't exactly tell her what to say word for word, but kind of told her what he wants to see happen. He wants to create some kind of an atmosphere where David can understand that bringing back Abshalom is not a bad thing. And the woman, the wise woman, figures out how to do that, what the case should be, what the story should be to present before David. So watch what she says.
So the men haven't been doing so well. It's time to bring in a lady.
Okay. We'll take that comment. That's all right. We'll take that one. Yeah.
Sometimes you'll take the advice from a third party.
Yeah.
not from someone else.
Yeah. And look, you'll see why specifically he needs a woman. He's going to appeal from a motherly perspective about children. Okay. Comes the woman and says to the king, the king says, what's troubling you? Tell me. Obviously, he could see she's dressed in a certain way that something's bothering her. And she says, Aval isha almana ani vayamot ishi. He says, I am a widowed woman. My husband has since died. That's not who she's mourning for, though. To your maidservant, I had two sons. The two of them got into a fight in the field. And nobody was there to get in between them and break up the fight. And one of my sons hit the other and killed him, struck him dead. Okay? Now, she's obviously grieving over the loss of one of her two children, an unthinkable tragedy. But now she's got an extra problem. In verse 7, she says, the rest of the family has now started to harass your maidservant, she's talking about herself. And they're saying to her, we want to put the other son to death for killing his brother. For the soul of his brother whom he killed. He deserved the death penalty. And let us destroy the inheritor. And the mother says, but they're going to extinguish the coal that is left burning. They will quench the last ember remaining to me and leave my husband without name or remnant upon the earth. So the woman is telling David, I'm stuck. What am I stuck? I had two children. One of them brutally killed the other. And now everyone's telling me that my one son who killed his other one needs to be put to death. And I kind of understand where they're coming from, but I don't want to do it because this is my only remaining son. If I lose my other son, I have no inheritor. I have no continuity to my family. My husband has passed away. What remnant will I have of my first husband other than his children? So what do you see here? What is she doing? It's essentially, it's a mashal for what David is going through, right? David is stuck between a rock and a hard place. The woman is saying, I'm stuck between a rock and a hard place. I'm going to get to the differences in a minute. Hold on for just a minute, right? But at first glance, she's saying, I'm stuck between a rock and a hard place because on the one hand, I understand one of my children killed the other. He's deserving of a consequence. On the other hand, I don't want to give him this consequence because it's going to undermine my husband and the continuity of my family. You could see she chooses her words very carefully to elicit sympathy from David. What words in the pasuk does she use to try and strike sympathy in the heart of David? That David will give her protection from killing her other son. what kind of sentiments does she share in this pasuk? Okay, so she talks about by extinguishing the coal, the ember, the last burning light. What else does she say? Good. Al peneh ha'adama, very poetic in that language. Al peneh ha'adama. I'm going to come back to that a little bit. She also calls the other son Hayoresh, the inheritor, right? It's not just one of my sons. He's the only inheritor of the legacy of my family. And that's what human beings need. Human beings long for somebody to inherit them, right? Anyone would be very, very pained by not having somebody who's going to continue both the physical and spiritual legacies of their family. So she's saying this, if we nashmida et hayoresh, they're going to take away my inheritor. What continuity am I going to have as a person? How will anybody remember me or remember my husband? Yeah.
In that time, did they also believe that if a woman doesn't have a husband or male children, did she not get supported? Like how would she be supported? Would that be her only support?
So that could be part of it, right? Generally speaking, sons would support their mother, right? She's definitely telling him, I'm gonna have a hard time living on my own. Who's gonna take care of me in addition to all of the other problems that I'm gonna have if I lose this child? There's no question that that's there as well.
Did they marry their
There's no yibum here because she has children. That's the whole idea, right? Yibum, why do we have that mitzvah of yibum? To continue the legacy. God forbid somebody dies without children, so they want to continue the legacy through the brother. If somebody has children, their children will continue their legacy. Problem is now the husband is already gone, and now the children are going to go. Now we're stuck. We're stuck with no legacy, no continuity. That's what she's worried about.
It's repetitive.
Exactly. So my husband, right?
Obviously, your husband.
I've gone through multiple tragedies here. I've had tons of loss. I can't bear to have another loss, even though I understand why they want to take him away from me. I can't bear another loss. I'll accept this son with all his faults, just so that I know I have some kind of continuity here. So this is a very impassioned plea, and you can see where the parallel is going to come in to David. And Sarah, I'm going to give you an opportunity to share what you think the difference is in a moment. So the king says to the woman, go home, and I will issue an order on your behalf. In other words, he says, go home and I'll make sure that you're taken care of. I'll make sure you're protected. I'm going to issue a decree that nobody harass you, nobody attack you, and that you and your son should be able to be okay. But you can see David is not necessarily moved. He's not struck ad kedei kach. He just says, I'll go home and I'll make an order. The woman is not sold on that. The woman persists towards the king and says, Alai Adoni HaMelech he'avon ve'al bet avi ve'hamelech ve'kis'o nakish. She says a very strange thing. She says, my Lord King, may the guilt be on me and my ancestral home. Your Majesty and her throne are guiltless. What do you think she means by that? Bit of a strange thing to say. She's kind of pressing him a little bit more. She's saying, you're going to issue a decree, but it's not really your fault. In other words, it's my fault as to why this is happening, right? Don't say you're going to issue a decree as if you have, this was your responsibility, right? It's really me. The avon is on me. The sin is on me, and you and your throne are guiltless. But what should happen if you just issue an order and something happens? Then the guilt's going to come upon you. I think you might need to do a little bit more than that, is what she's hinting to the king. So the king says, okay, let me think about it. Vayomer HaMelech, David responds, Hamdaber elayich v'haveto elay v'lo yosif od laga'at bach. If anyone says anything else to you, have him brought to me. I want to see that guy, and he will never trouble you again. So you can see here now, David takes it up a notch. Not only is he going to decree that nobody touch her and that everybody leave them alone, but there's going to be a consequence for anybody who does overturn the king's decree and harasses her. They're going to be brought to the king, and the king's going to deal with them. She's still not satisfied. But Tomer, she says, Yizkorna hamelech et Adonai Elohecha meharbat goel hadam l'shachet v'lo yashmidu et beni. She says to him, I don't think you're truly understanding the severity or the passion that these adversaries have for killing my son. You think that they're just like calling up the phone and hanging up or ordering 52 pizzas in the middle of the night to prank them. That's not what's happening over here. This is Goel Hadam, right? Goel Hadam is a blood avenger. The other relatives of my son, they are out for killing. They're enraged. They're not going to be convinced by the king sent an order. They don't care. Oh, the king said you'll come to me. They don't care. They are, she says to him, let your majesty be mindful of the Lord your God and restrain the blood avenger bent on destruction. These people are not going to be deterred, king, by these little things that you're threatening to do. And that's not going to happen so that my son may not be killed. So David says, Vayomer, Hai Adonai, he says, by as God lives, im yipol misa'arat benech arza, not a hair of your son shall fall on the ground. Now that's a much stronger language. David is saying, I'm going to personally ensure that your son is taken care of. Not a hair of your son's head is going to fall. It's not just I'm going to try to protect him, and if something goes wrong, we'll handle it afterwards. No. I'm going to make sure that everything here happens the way it's supposed to. I think we have hair coming at least from this way. No, it's okay. It's good. No, it's fine. So you see, after a couple of different pressings up against David, David finally gets to the point where the woman wants him to get to, which is, I'm going to make sure that nothing happens to your child. It's not just I'm going to bring him back and I'm going to take care of him, and if anything happens, I'll handle it afterwards. He says, no, I'm going to make a real concerted effort to ensure that nothing happens to your son. Okay? Now remember, it sounds a little bit like this is very real in the eyes of the woman. Remember, this is all a charade. She doesn't really have any of this. This is all a made-up mashal so that David will understand what he needs to do with Abshalom. But Tomer Haisha, and now the woman transitions. Now she says, after she got to where she wanted David to be, how much he needs to protect the son, the straggling son, and that's what she wants him to do to Abshalom. She's ready to reveal the nimshal to him, what it really means. But Tomer Haisha in verse 12, Tidaber na shivchatecha el Adoni hamelech davar. So now the woman says to David, let your maidservant speak words into the ears of David, my master, the king. And he says, Daberi, tell me what you want to say. And now she reveals to him the point. And here it's a little interesting. We're going to read a couple of Pesukim, and now the next Pesukim are going to be a little bit disjointed. It's the train of thought isn't going to be so clear. And I'll try to explain why that is. But Tomer Haisha, the woman says, Velama hashavta kazot al am Elohim. Why then have you planned the like against God's people? If this is how you are willing to behave towards me and my children, why are you doing it differently towards the rest of the Jewish people? Umidaber hamelech hadavar hazeh ke'ashem levilti hashiv hamelech et nidcho. Why then have you planned this against God's people? In making this pronouncement, your majesty condemns himself in that your majesty does not bring back his own banished one. You now, by having this conversation with me, just condemned yourself. You just showed why your own behavior is not the way you should be behaving yourself, right? You are willing to go out on a limb to protect my son, by the way, made up son, right? And you understand that even though by letter of the law he deserves to die, because of the circumstances and the context, you're willing to protect him and make sure he's taken care of. Why won't you do the same thing in your own family that is going to be necessary for the Jewish people? Because after all, what are we now worried about? We're thinking ahead to who's going to what? Who's going to be king after David, right? And who seems to be the likely candidate of who to be king after David at this point? Abshalom seems to be the likely candidate. So here we have the legacy, the Yoresh of the king who's banished and should be brought back based on all of the factors that we just talked about, and yet you leave him in exile. Why are you doing this to the rest of your people?
Why is Abshalom the likely?
We shall see in a moment why he's likely. It seems he's both the most good-looking, charismatic. Doesn't always mean everything, which is a good point. It's another. We will see that will be another element of the theme, that always the person who looks on the outside like the most fitting typically is not always the one to be the most
Where is
fitting.
he? Is he birth order? Is he
We don't
soon?
exactly know birth order, but it seems as though he's high up on that, right? It's clear that David pines for him because he understands maybe a similar concept of Abshalom's role in the family. So it seems as though Abshalom could be the next one in line, right?
And that's how he was able to lead the rebellion.
That's what he's going to end up being able to turn against David, 100%. Let's take a look at verse 14. Kimot namut v'chamayim hanigarim arza. We must all die. We are all like water, asher lo ye'asefu, that is poured on the ground and cannot be gathered up. V'lo yisa Elohim nefesh v'chashav machashavot. God will not take away the life of one who makes plans, levilti yidah mimenu nidah, so that no one may be kept banished. This is a very interesting pasuk. What is she trying to say? This is a little bit odd, right? She says, we're all going to die. We're all like water that's poured on the ground and cannot be gathered up. So God doesn't take away life of a person who made plans, so nobody should be kept in banishment. What is she saying?
God's in charge. Hashem's in charge. We can't play God.
Okay, so meaning that why are you now keeping him on the outs? Everyone is eventually going to die. Something happens. In other words, why is she saying everyone's going to die? Like, don't look at the fact that he killed Amnon as such a bad thing. Everyone's going to die at some point anyway, right? Which is a little bit of a tough thing to say, right? But everyone's going to die and everyone gets gathered up. And so God is the one who should take away the life. You shouldn't be the one to determine who's on the outs and who's on the in. So again, she's kind of grasping at straws a little bit here, but she's trying to build an argument, and it seems this is not maybe the best argument to make, right? This is why I was saying her words are a bit disjointed. She probably could have did without this. Let's see how she continues. And the reason I have come to say these things to the king, is that the people have frightened me. And so the maidservant, your maidservant decided to speak to the king. Maybe the king will act on behalf of his handmaiden's plea. What is she talking about? What does it mean she's afraid? Afraid of what? It seems like she's continuing the charade. She's back into the charade, even though we really went into the reality. She's now almost backpedaling to the charade and keeping up this idea that there's actually two children, and she's nervous about one of them being killed, and that's why she came to the king in the first place. Very odd. But why should she care? She's okay, maybe, but she seems to be a random woman in Tekoa, probably more involved in her own life than anything else. Right? So it sounds like she's now all of a sudden like waffling back and forth between the reality and the nimshal and the mashal and what's true and what's not. You know, sometimes when a person acts out something or takes on a charade, they almost convince themselves of how true it is, right? And almost they play the part so well that they actually become the person, right?
But also, I know that if you're telling a lie, this is the king you're telling the lie to. Maybe she's also afraid of being called out that, you know,
That's a
you're
good point.
deceiving.
So maybe you're saying the woman doesn't really, she's using her example to teach the king, but she's not necessarily wanting to tell him that she's made it up, right? Maybe she wants to tell him, I brought this to you, and it happens to be that we're both in a very similar situation, but my situation might actually be true. So maybe she's keeping up the charade so as not to tell him that it was totally a mashal.
The king, you're a fool. This is what has to be
That's an
done.
interesting take. I will be supported by that in the fact that David reads through this. David recognizes that that's not really genuine. Yeah.
Very side point. But is Tekoa a real place? Because
Yes.
it looks like tikya, like the word looks like when you're repenting and you're.
That's an interesting thing. You're very keen on names. You like that stuff. No, but it's true. It's very important. I didn't put anything together about whether tekoa and tikia and repentance has anything to do with it.
Sometimes I get my
Yes,
spellings
no,
wrong, but-
100%. Tikia has that. Is it a coincidence that this is where she comes from? Why would she necessarily come? Why does the text keep repeating that she's from Tekoa? I didn't see any significance necessarily lent to that, but definitely this chapter does speak about bringing somebody back from exile and returning somebody and the concept of teshuvah. So it could be that she's called Isha HaTekoi to remind us of the concept of giving people a second chance, and that's kind of what her plea is to the king on behalf of Abshalom. What's unfortunate here is that in this instance, Abshalom really shouldn't have gotten a second chance. David gives it to him, and that's a mistake. It'll eventually turn into a mistake on his part. What Rabbi Bazak tries to say over here is that an idea we've seen in the past before as well. Sometimes when a person speaks with a lot of emotion and a lot of passion, they often do not speak coherently, right?
Yes.
They often don't organize their thoughts so clearly. And sometimes they can see themselves waffling back and forth between this idea and that idea, maybe even what's real and what's not real, because the person is speaking with such emotion that they have a hard time organizing. So even though this woman is Isha HaKama, who may be prepared and rehearsed in advance, at this moment she's speaking to the king with a lot of depth and a lot of emotion, to the point where Rabbi Bazak says maybe she's not so lucid in her train of thought, which is why she keeps going back and forth in and out of mashal, nimshal, reality, not reality. But the point will get across through the passion that she has towards the king. So that could be another explanation to what's going on over here. But David definitely gets the message. We'll finish up her last two pesukim and then see David's reaction to this. Verse 16, for your majesty would surely agree to deliver his handmaid from the hands of anyone who would seek the hashmid oti ve'et beni yachad minahalat Elohim, anyone who would seek to cut off both me and my son from the heritage of God. Again, she's keeping up on the nimshal. Vatomer shivhatecha, and she says further, your maidservant thought, Yena devar adoni hamelech limnuha, let the word of my lord the king provide comfort. Ki kemalach Elohim ken adoni hamelech, like an angel of God, so too is my lord the king. Lishmoa hatov vehara, to hear both the good and the bad. Vadonai Elohecha yeh imach, and may the Lord your God be with you. Notice how she throws in the air, understanding everything good and bad. In other words, sometimes people bring things to the king that are good about him, sometimes bad. But one of the great character traits of David that everybody seems to know is David has the ability both to hear his positives and his shortcomings and be able to adjust his behavior accordingly with the help of Hashem. So she's basically, in a nutshell, with all of this poetic language and all of this emotion, saying, you and I are very similar to each other. We both find ourselves in a similar situation. Just like you're telling me to protect my son and that you will help me to protect my son, you should certainly bring back your banished son and protect him as well. Let's see how David reacts to that. Questions or comments so far on this point? Okay, let's go to verse 18. Vayan hamelech vayomer el ha'isha. The king says to the woman, Al na tikahadi mimeni davar. Don't hold anything back from me, right? Asher anochi shoel otach, from what I'm about to ask you. Vatomer ha'isha, the woman says, Yedaberna adoni hamelech, let my lord the king speak. Verse 19, Vayomer hamelech, the king says, Hayad Yoav itach bechol. Did Yoav put you up to all of this? In other words, the king clearly sensed that something was afoot, and he understood Yoav might do something like this. And he says, does Yoav put you up to this? Vatan Haisha, the woman says, Vatomer, and she said, Hen Avshecha, it is on your life, the king. That's a language of swear and honor to the king. Adoni HaMelech, my lord the king, in ish lehemin ulehasmil, mikol asher diber Adoni HaMelech. So she says, it is just as my lord the king says, just as you anticipated. Ki avdecha Yoav hu tzivani. It was indeed Yoav who commanded me to do this. He put in the mouth of your maidservant all of these words from which to say to you. Why? He had good intentions. Verse 20. It was to conceal the real purpose of the matter. That your servant Yoav did this thing. Instead of just coming straight to you and saying, bring back Abshalom, that would not necessarily strike a chord with the king the way this mashal does. This is the second time now that we've seen somebody approach the king and offer him some kind of a mashal so that the king David himself will establish the sentence, and then they reveal to him, based on what you said, this is what you should be doing in this situation. It's a much, I don't know what I'm looking for, right? it's a much clearer way, I guess you could say, or much more potent way of striking a chord with the king to get him to do something. We saw Natan did this to get David to realize what he did wrong with Bathsheba. Now Yoav is doing it to get David to realize what he needs to do with Abshalom, at least from Yoav's perspective.
Letting him come to the decision on his own.
True.
Telling him this is what
Yes,
he has to do.
yes. But as we also pointed out over there, it's more respectful, but it's also more effective. When you get somebody to recognize through this method what they're doing wrong, and they can actually say on their own and come to the realization on their own, it makes for a much easier change than someone saying, you need to do this. Well, they're going to be defensive against you. When I present it to you in this way, and you yourself said that that's how you would behave in this situation, so now try and extract from there to this situation, how are you going to do it? It almost puts the person in chains. Like, what's David going to say now? No, I'm not going to do. He just said he was going to do that for the woman. How's he not going to do that for his own son, right?
No, I was going to say defensiveness.
Yeah, it takes away all that defensiveness because you just said it out of your own mouth, right?
I know I always do this and I can cite prior to it, but that's like exactly what happens in the therapy room also. Like if the therapist tells you what you need to change and what you need to do, you're not doing it, but like we try to get the person to get to their own realization.
Through a line of
We'll-
questioning.
Right, we'll ask certain questions or we'll bring certain things up, but
Role playing.
it means more if the person comes up with it themselves, then they're more likely to actually do something about it.
Right.
than if they just have it.
Right. Not to mention, what if David did turn around and say to this woman, no, I think they should kill your son, and I think we should leave it alone. All right, well, then you're not going to get anywhere with Abshalom, certainly in this situation. If that's what he wanted to rule, then that's what he would have said. So, yeah, sometimes through this method, you'll also reveal something that maybe you didn't see, instead of just coming and telling the person what you think is going to be right. And so that's definitely how Yoav plays it, and it seems to work. Unfortunately, in this situation, it doesn't work out in the long run, as it were, right? And that could be why, Sarah. What difference did you want to say before that exists between the woman and her case versus David and Abshalom's situation?
People who could carry on his legacy. She said she kept harping on the fact that this is my only one, he's my last one. That's not really the case with David.
Okay, so David has other people. That's a big one, right? The situation of this woman, the way she describes, and maybe she's not even so careful 100% with the details of how she orchestrated, maybe that was intentional or not, but she describes the murder of one of her children in the heat of the fight. One killed the other. Abshalom's murder towards Amnon was a premeditated one. He waited almost 2 years before he got back at Amnon and conceived this entire situation in which he would be able to kill Amnon in cold blood. That's a very, very different experience, a very, very different approach than the one that David would have with the Isha Tekoit. So there seem to be some mismatches here in the example that the Isha Tekoit brings versus the particular details of David and Abshalom's situation, right? I wanted just to go back for just a minute. The way the woman describes in her mashal the murder of her children, or the murder of one of her two children, does that remind you of any other type of murder in the Torah?
Oh, I was going to say, talking about Yoav, the fight at the water, that Yoav kind of instigated another situation, and they started play fighting, and it ended up.
Right. So Yoav is guilty himself of a murder from instigation, which caused other people to die. Then Avner killed many people, 100%. So it means that Yoav himself may have a very blurred line as far as what is, passionate murder, right, or happens right away in the heat of it, versus what is premeditated, right? Remember, Avner. Let's take it back for just a minute. Avner killed Yoav's brother, but that was because Yoav's brother was chasing him, right? He was chasing him to kill him, and Avner kept telling him, "Stop chasing me because I'm going to kill you." And he didn't listen. Amasad didn't listen. I don't want to do it to you, and he kept doing it, and Avner had to kill him. Yoav looked at that as flat out murder, and that's why Yoav, what does he do? He premeditates the murder of Avner, and David loses it, right? David understands this is not the same. What Avner did to Yoav's brother in the heat of a war is not the same as what Yoav did to Avner, and in deceitfully putting him in a situation where he's going to kill him. So Yoav is already known for being somebody who blurs a little bit between wartime murder and premeditated vengeful murder, right? Which is exactly what Abshalom did, right? Abshalom committed an act of killing Amnon in cold blood, premeditated murder, right? But he might not see that 100%. The example of the Isha Tekoit is one where they were in a fight, the tensions rose, and one person may have killed the other, in the heat of the disagreement, right? That reminds us of, you said it before, Cain and Hevel, right? The murder of Cain and Hevel. Notice, by the way, the Isha Tekoit, where does she say the setting of this murder happened? Again, it's a fictitious murder. It happened in the field, right? Why does she put that detail in there? Like, does that even matter that it happened in the field? That seems to be a very odd thing to say. She wouldn't even really need to include that detail. I'm trying to find what pasuk it was in. And En Matzil in him, there's nobody else. They were alone. It's Vav Sarah, you said? Yes. Yes. Now, if you take a look, if you want to turn your, was it Sarah who said it? I was going to say it. Oh, Alana, sorry. I'm just looking in my direction and you look exactly alike. So if you want to hold your place, go all the way to Bereshit. Then go right to the first murder in the Torah. Is going to be in chapter, I'm going to say it's in chapter 5, I believe. No, maybe earlier than that, chapter 4. It's in chapter 4 of Bereshit. And let's take a look at Pasuk in chapter 4, Pasuk 8. Yeah. Julie, want to read it?
Okay.
Yeah. Whatever you like.
ויאמר קין אל הבל אחי ויהי בהיותם בשדה ויקם קין אל הבל אחיו ויהרגהו.
Notice the Torah describes the killing of Cain and Hevel, two brothers in the field, nobody around, right? And what happens when one kills the other? How many children do Adam and Chava have at this point? 2 children, right? When Cain kills Hevel, who's left? Cain. Cain's the only one who's left, right? Now, what should happen to Cain after he kills Hevel? What should happen to him? He should be put to death, right? God should kill him. Adam should kill him. He should be put to death. Why don't they put Cain to death? Cain pleads to God and says, God, please don't kill me, right? It's the first murder. I didn't know, but whatever claims he makes. But definitely a backstory is, if Cain goes down, what happens? There's nobody left, right? Now it happens to be Adam and Chava still around, so they end up having another child. They have Shet to replace Hevel, etc. But at that moment, Cain makes the claim, if I go, there's nobody left. Who else is going to continue the legacy? Sound familiar? It's the same situation as the Isha Tekoit is saying. The Yoresh, the inheritor, is gone, right? So why do you think she does this? Why do you think she plays on the story of Cain and Hevel? How does that help her?
Because God decided the first one. He said, if you follow God's ways, this
Very
is what you
good.
would want.
Exactly. She's saying to him, hey, take your cue from God himself. You have a murder of 2 brothers. One is not there anymore. He's going to be lost as the inheritor. What did God do? He spared Cain. You do the same thing.
But David might have like a on that. I mean, he even know that she was referencing, which is like subconsciously he realized.
Potentially subconsciously realized it. Maybe he even picked up on it, right? He understood. She's definitely trying to trigger something inside of David that takes us back to the very first murder that existed. Liz, you want to say something?
Her whole point is to get him.
But also to forgive him. Well, that's what it's going to take to bring him back. To bring Abshalom back and to make him a part of the monarchy is going to take forgiveness on the part of
Cain was
David.
still punished.
He was punished. He had his consequence. What was his consequence, by the way?
Under the earth?
Banishment.
Oh.
Right? But at some point, what has to happen? Some point, he's got to come back, right? So a person experiences a temporary period of exile and banishment, and then they have to be brought back into the fold, right? And that's what has to happen. Cain's legacy and his people are brought back into the fold. So she's definitely playing on all of these different elements to say, all right, Abshalom's been in banishment for several years already. We know you pine for him. He's your inheritor. He committed this act very similar to Cain, but if God could forgive Cain, why can't you forgive Abshalom? Bring him back, let him be part of the fold. And as you see in the way I brought you this story, it's very similar. You could understand that it's justifiable. What she's giving to David is his ability to say, I can bring Abshalom back without it telling everybody I support murder. That was the problem. David wants to bring Abshalom back, but he's afraid of how it's going to look to everybody that he brought back his son who killed his brother in cold blood, right? So she's telling him, no, don't worry, they're not going to look at it like that. This is how they're going to look at it. He had his punishment. He had his exile. He'll come back. He'll take over and it'll all be good. And David buys it. David takes that and that's what he's going to go ahead and do, right? But not 100%. So let's keep reading the chapter.
I have a question, Rabbi.
Yes.
But there are other inheritors. So if Abshalom doesn't come back, there is still somebody who can continue the legacy of David.
True.
So why
true. 100%.
does that not count?
You're right. That would be, if we were speaking from a logical, unemotional perspective, maybe you'd be right. But don't forget, David really feels that Abshalom is the right man for the job. So if he can find a way where people will look at it differently, he'll take him back, right? You're right. That a point, David should probably turn around and say, but I have other people, so I'm not interested in dealing with him. In the end of the day, it's his son. And you'll see in a moment, the text will describe Abshalom to us, right? And that is something that cannot be underestimated in just a moment. You'll get there. So you're right. David is somewhat being manipulated here by the members of the cabinet to bring Abshalom back.
Is Yoav usurping, right?
No, you don't want him to be that,
But fathers are like that for their sons sometimes. And
you told him the story, and he's like, no, do this, and
you're right.
and he didn't realize that. The second time he realized it, but late in the story, the first time he didn't realize.
Yeah, I hear it. It's definitely a hard thing to stomach when you're looking at David. But also remember where David is at this point. David is preoccupied. David is obsessed and entrenched in his own shortcomings, in his own sin of Bathsheba, right? That's all of this is happening in that aftermath. So when a person is distracted, when a person is consumed by their own shortcomings, when there's maybe some guilt and self-loathing on the part of David for what he had done with Bathsheba, all of a sudden his compass is distorted, and it's very hard for him to navigate through all of this manipulation that's going on. So he's looking at it as, I want to see the best in people. My son Abshalom can come back. He can repent. Maybe let's take a step back. Just had an epiphany. David is thinking about what? What's David thinking about for himself? What process is David in? Second chances in Teshuvah. So how's David going to stop that from his own son Abshalom? If he wants to have Teshuvah for his crime, right? That he's definitely is weighing on his mind and on his shoulders. How can he stop his son Abshalom from having a potential comeback as well? So maybe David, I don't want to call it naivete, but in his goodness, in his desire to see another hero repentance story besides his own, wants to give Abshalom the best. But in this case, it's going to be misplaced. We often see this with David, good rooted, but misplaced. And that brings him some problems, right?
What is Yoav's motive?
Yoav's motive is an interesting question, right? Yoav realizes, Yoav is all about power, for sure. Why do you think he's doing this?
Has to be for selfish reasons.
Okay, he wants to get in with what?
Abshalom.
He wants to get in with the next.
king.
If he thinks to himself, Abshalom's the next king, then what better way to ingratiate himself to the new king than by bringing Abshalom back into the fold? Abshalom will get the new king. I'm Yoav, boom, right? I mean, it's a soap opera. If the thing is, and I hate to say it like that, but all of these things are playing a role. Everybody wants to, get in and push and tug of war and power. These are all things. Now, I'm not saying these people also don't have Bnei Israel's best motives in mind, right? But they're trying to solidify a government to keep the stability of the Jewish people going on, for sure. No question. Let's try to push a little bit forward here now and see what the king does. Yoav and Abshalom are going to have a little bit of a tussle with each other, and you'll see how the chapter ends. We're up to verse 21, I believe. Yeah. Vayomer hamelech el Yoav. So now the king comes directly to Yoav. He says, Hinena asiti et hadavar hazeh, velech hashevet hana'ar et Abshalom. He says to Yoav, I will do this thing that you obviously wanted me to do. Go and bring back my son Abshalom.
Boy, how old is he?
Here,
My boy.
Na'ar. He'll always be a Na'ar. It's his son, right? It's his boy, right? He does call him a Na'ar, right? Vayipol Yoav el panav arza vayishtahu. Yoav prostrates himself before the king in humility. Vayvarech et hamelech. He blesses the king. Vayomer Yoav. Yoav says, Hayom yada avdecha ki matzati hen be'enecha adoni hamelech. Today your servant knows that he has found favor in your eyes. Talking about himself. Asher asa hamelech et devar avdecha. Now that the king has done the request of your servant. Vayakom Yoav vayelech Geshura vayave et Abshalom Yerushalayim. Yoav gets up, he goes to Geshur, which is where Abshalom has been, and he brings Abshalom back to Jerusalem. Now, how will Abshalom be received by David once he actually comes back? All of a sudden, David plays hard to get. Very strange. David seemed to be opened up by Yoav and this whole mashal, and it seems he wants to bring Abshalom back. But at the last minute, David kind of gets cold feet. He says, yeah, bring him back, but I don't want to see him. Don't bring him to me. Look at what happens. Maybe still giving him, he wants to see something else from Abshalom. He wants to see a little bit more. He can come back to Jerusalem, but let's see what happens. So let's see what happens. Verse 24, Vayomer hamelech yisov el beto. But the king says, send him straight to his house. 2 years. If I'm not mistaken, let's look back at the last. 3 years. 3 years. 3 years. Second to last pasuk of chapter 13. Avshalom barach vayelech Geshur vahisham shalosh shanim. 3 years they were apart from each other. Okay. What was 2 years? Yes. Good. I knew 2 years was in my head for something. Yes. Correct. Yes.
And she's just hanging out in his house. She's just done
Who's
that.
she? Oh, we don't know where.
never hear of her again.
We don't hear Tamar again. What's going to be ironic is Abshalom has a daughter named Tamar.
Maybe
Yeah.
he names her after her.
Maybe like almost to give her life or something. Yeah.
Like Tamar means bitter, like why do people keep?
No, Tamar means a date,
Dates.
like a Tamara. It has the word mar in it. Mar means bitter, but Tamar doesn't mean bitter in that kind. Yeah. Where were we? So the king says, I want him to go straight home. Upanav lo yir'eh. Apanai lo yir'eh. I don't want him to see my face. Vayisov Abshalom el beto. Abshalom goes home. Ufnei hamelech lo ra'ah. And the face of the king he did not see. Now, okay, maybe David needs some time. Maybe he brings him to Yerushalayim, but he needs a little bit. So Abshalom takes that. But time goes by and he wants an audience with the king. Now here, look, there's almost like a little bracket here.
Yes.
The Torah,
Yes.
there's a little space here.
He's
The
kind of
Navi, the Navi is going to describe Abshalom's physical beauty. Abshalom lo haya ish yafeh bechol Yisrael lehalel meod. No one in all of Israel was admired for his beauty as Abshalom. Mikaf raglo ve'ad kodkodo. From the foot to his crown, to the crown of his head, lo haya bo mum. There was no blemish. Describes him as being
That's-
perfect
That's
as
the
far as
opposite
his
of
name.
David when they explain David.
David was described as having nice eyes, but certainly he was redheaded, and
Red hair.
his physical appearance was not striking in any way to Shemuel. Shemuel thought one of his older brothers was much more striking. Remember the lesson Hashem taught Shemuel because he thought he was going to crown not David. What did Hashem say to David, to Shemuel? Ha'adam yir'eh la'enayim. Man sees with his eyes, but God, Adonai yir'eh la'levav. God sees into the heart. One of the common threads of the whole saga of David is avoiding looking at the external and focusing on the internal. Remember how did they describe Shaul, the first king?
Also most beautiful.
Also very handsome,
Taller than everyone.
taller than everybody, Mishichmo Vamala, right? Anybody who has great physical appearance, generally speaking,
Hasn't been working out.
right, hasn't been working out. Why? Because it's very hard to manage when you're so attractive and good looking, not allowing that to what? To impact your ego, right? To not impact your you're looking at yourself, your selfishness, right? And others on the other side, it's different. That's what makes, by the way, we're going from thing to thing. That's what makes Yosef such an amazing character, because Yosef has that. Yosef is described as Yefat To'ar Vifat Mar'eh, and he has to battle with it. As she says, at one point, Yosef was stroking his hair and looking at himself in the mirror. So what did God do? He humbled him with who? Potiphar's wife. Everything. Anytime Yosef gets a little bit too full of himself, God puts him right down. And the text tells us he's good looking just for that purpose. So anytime the text tells us somebody's really good looking, it's not just because particular. Yes, the women who are good looking are very good. Many, yes, 100%. 100%. Yes, good point. Good point. For the Torah or the Tanakh to describe a man in such a way is only if it makes an important impact, an effect on the story, right? And very often it's them having to overcome that idea. So the same will be for Abshalom. And it continues, verse 26. Ubegaleho et rosho. When he would cut his hair, the hayam miketz yamim layamim. He would do this once a year. Abshalom would cut his hair. Asher yigaleach, when he would shave. Ki chaved alav, because it would grow so long, it would weigh him down. Vegileho, so he would cut it. Ushkal et se'ar rosho, they would weigh and evaluate the price of his hair. 200 shkalim be'even hamelech. It weighed 200 shekel in royal weight, right? Now, his hair is obviously a very valuable thing, 100%, something that people are looking at. Vayivaredu le'Abshalom shlosha banim. Abshalom gives birth to three sons. Ubat ahat, and one daughter, Ushma Tamar, and her name is Tamar. She was also Isha Yefat Mar'eh, a woman of very good looks, very attractive. Yes.
I really believe that this Tamar in the naming is proving this whole legacy thing.
Okay.
This Tamar doesn't have a family, and this is his way of honoring his sister and giving her a chance.
Very
to
likely.
have a legacy.
Very likely.
You don't think she got married to someone else and had?
We don't
I
know.
still think-
Could be. Could be.
Come on.
I would have to look. We have to look into some of the commentaries, which I didn't
Like
get a
it's
chance
sad
to
never hear
explore.
about her again. It's a little bit
Yeah, 100%, no question. So one wonders, like, what is this doing here, right? Why all of a sudden, in the middle of the story of Abshalom's return, did we all of a sudden interject 3 verses having to do with Abshalom's beauty and his children and how beautiful his children are, right?
The public loves them.
Public loves them. David also could be enamored with them for this as well, right? Why does David? He sees his young son as a very charismatic, very attractive person. He's fit to be a king, right? Almost forgetting his own path to becoming the king versus his predecessor, Shaul. The hair comes in later because eventually Abshalom will be hanged by his hair. Yes, so the hair will come into play. Yes. So there are some who say that Abshalom, they try to connect his physical thing to his spiritual idea. They notice that it says once a year he would cut his hair when it got too heavy, right? Basically, there's a rule that when a person accepts upon himself a vow of being a Nazir, he's not allowed to cut his hair until the hair weighs down on him so much that he's given a license according to halakha to be able to cut it. Now, how him being a Nazir would play a role? My answer to that would be, and we don't have time to develop this just yet, we'll try to develop it as the chapters go along. What other person was a Nazir who also had a very tragic ending? Shimshon, right? There will be a lot of parallels between Abshalom and Shimshon that the rabbis will make, the way that they die by their hair, how their hair is their greatest asset, but also their greatest weakness, how they use it to sin. There'll be a lot of comparisons between those two. So I want to hold that idea just for a moment and we'll come back to it. If you have another 5 minutes, I want to just try to read to the end of the chapter. I know it's 12:02, but let's see, we're up to Pasuk 28. Let's just read to the end, and then that'll set us up for the next week, and we'll come back and develop some of these ideas further. I know it's a long chapter. Vayeshev Abshalom b'Yerushalayim shnatayim yamin. Abshalom resides in Yerushalayim for 2 whole years, ufnei hamelech lo ra'ah, without ever seeing the face of the king. So now we're 7 years, by the way, after his crime. Add another 2 years to the timeline. Vayishlach Abshalom el Yoav. Finally, Abshalom becomes impatient. And he sends to Yoav, who was the one who brought him home, No, get me into the king. Okay, you brought me here. Why'd you bring me here if I'm not going to get a chance to see my father, the king? But Yoav would not come to him. Abshalom's request to Yoav falls on deaf ears. He sends to him again. And Yoav again ignores Abshalom. So now if you're Abshalom, you're going to get frustrated. The king doesn't want to see me. Yoav, who made all this effort to bring me back here so that I can maybe take over or be involved, he doesn't want to see me. What's happening here? I'm just sitting here like a statue. What am I doing here? And so Abshalom takes matters into his own hands. He says to his servants, he says, you see how Yoav's field is right next to my field? He's got barley over there. Go light it on fire, burn it. And the servants do it. They light Yoav's field on fire. Okay. That gets Yoav's attention. He comes straight to Abshalom, to his house. He says, why did your servants light up my field and put it on fire? Abshalom says, okay, now that I got your attention, Abshalom says to Yoav, I sent word for you. I requested your audience. I wanted to talk to you, right? And you ignored me, right? It's saying, come to me. And that you could send me to the king saying, why did I come from exile to Geshur if not to be with the king? Better that you would have left me there if you're not going to have a conversation with me. I want to see the face of the king. And if there's still a transgression that you don't want to see me, then just put me to death already and end it. Yoav comes to the king, and he says to the king everything that Abshalom told him. And the king finally relents. He calls to Abshalom and he brings him in front of him. He bows and prostrates before him twice in front of the king. And the king kisses Abshalom. And this is how the chapter ends, right? So the seeds have been sown a little bit for Abshalom is back in the good graces of the king. This kiss is an interesting thing. What do you make of this little Vayishak Abshalom, Vayishak HaMelech LeAbshalom? What do you make of that kiss, or the way it's phrased in the words of the Torah? Huh? What is that? Okay. Okay. Doesn't apologize. Maybe Abshalom should have been. Well, Abshalom does prostrate himself before the king in a sign of humility. The king gives him a kiss back, which sounds like maybe we're getting to a point of reconciliation.
I think that David's common theme is a problem between controlling his personal and his public. And I think publicly he didn't want to acknowledge him and he had to keep the separation. But the minute he sees his son, he's overcome with his personal.
So he is right. And typically when David has allowed his personal side to overtake the public side, it hasn't worked out very well for him. Neither will it in this situation as well. Some commentaries I saw note how David did not, although he kissed Abshalom, he didn't fully embrace him, right? To the extent. In other words, how long, kind of like that, right? Think about it. How long have David and Abshalom not seen each other for, right? We're almost going on 5 years. 5 years. 5 years since it happened, right? 2, right.
The extra 2 is
exactly. That's what Tamar said. But 5 years they haven't seen each other. And after 5 years, you'd expect maybe a little bit more than just Vayishak. Compare that, for example, to Yaakov and Yosef embracing after not seeing each other. There it was decades, and their split was much under different terms. But they cry and they weep on each other, and they're full of emotion. You could see there's emotion on each person's part, but there's a little bit of coldness, there's a little bit of tension that you can kind of cut with a knife. That's like not described over here, that's in between them. So there's a lot of interesting things going on over here as Abshalom returns and has seen the king, but the king is a little skeptical. How will he be viewed? There's maybe a conflating his private and personal needs. He definitely takes the advice of Yoav, and notice how consistently the king is able to be manipulated. Every time someone asks something of the king, if you push the king a little bit more, he'll give in, right? And everybody seems to know it. The woman in her mashal pushes him a little bit more. He gives in. Yoav pushes him. He gives in, right? At this point, why didn't David, when Yoav comes to speak to David about Abshalom, why doesn't David say, no, I made the decision, I'm not seeing him. He can live here, but I don't want to see him. Right. So Abshalom himself doesn't even acknowledge what he did wrong. Right. So Abshalom's a little brazen on that part, right? That's interesting. Yeah, Abshalom doesn't come to David and says, please forgive me for the fact that I killed Amnon, understand why I did it. I was defending the honor of my sister. He just says, if there's anything wrong, kill me. And if not, let's go. And David is like,
I'm sorry.
All right, yeah, if you heard, I'm sorry, but I can't help you. And David gives into that, which is not David's MO. He's all about admitting your mistake. He doesn't quite get that from Abshalom, but he still allows Abshalom in. He still opens up. He relents. So we're seeing maybe David's principled nature getting a couple of cracks in there, and that's opening him up to some problems, which is going to lead to what we're going to have in the next chapter.
Abshalom was justified in putting the field on fire.
What about the field on fire?
You know what? Abshalom is a man of action and he gets things done.
Yes, but you're doing something against the law to get things done.
Well, it didn't work. Nothing else is working. No one else avenged his sister.
Right.
Yoav's not answering his calls. I kind of like this guy.
Abshalom is someone who sees what he wants and he's going to do what it takes. The ends justify the means for Abshalom, no question. Question is, do you want somebody like that to be your king, especially after David, who's all about the opposite of that? So, Abshalom at this point is an interesting figure. There could be some positives to him, but we see him do things that really take him in a bit of an extreme way. I don't know if we want somebody of his caliber being the king, and as we will see, that will not work out well. A lot more to dissect, but we've definitely laid the groundwork for what's going to happen in the coming chapters with the rebellion of Abshalom, to the point where Abshalom will actually cause David to have to flee. He'll have to run away. A lot of exciting things that are going to happen from here on in. Continue to join us week in and week out. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen.